Ethan Cole had always imagined frontier life would be quiet, maybe even peaceful. He had pictured himself alone on the edges of known space, cataloging alien flora, taking samples and recording data in a world untouched by humans. When he had volunteered for the mission to Raylos 4, he thought he was signing up for adventure, maybe a little danger, but nothing like the unexpected reality that awaited him. The research outpost was not large. It consisted of a few interconnected modules, each designed to house multiple species safely while keeping them separated when necessary. Its walls were thick, made of reinforced alloy, and the air circulation system was carefully monitored to prevent contamination. Normally, he liked the hum of the life support systems. It was soothing in a mechanical way, but today, the soft whirring seemed ominous. A red alert blinked across the wall panel. Lockdown. The word echoed through the module. No one could leave. No one could move between the quarters. The planetary sensors had detected an outbreak of an unknown microorganism, harmless to humans but potentially dangerous to some alien species. For Ethan, it was frustrating. He had just started to familiarize himself with his new roommate, and now they were trapped together with no way out until the quarantine lifted. Talara had arrived a few days earlier. Ethan had seen her in the common hall, tall and lithe, with white skin that almost glowed under the artificial lights. Her long hair flowed like silver silk, and the crown-like ridges on her head marked her status among her species. She had approached him politely, introduced herself, and offered a brief explanation of her needs and habits. Her presence had seemed elegant and distant, almost untouchable, yet there had been a quiet intensity in her eyes that made Ethan careful about his actions. Now, confined together, the distance shrank. Ethan felt the weight of the silence between them. They both moved cautiously, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of their shared space. Talara spoke only when necessary, her voice calm, controlled, and a little musical, like wind over glass. Ethan respected that. He had learned early in life that some beings, human or otherwise, required space to think and process. He did not want to break that boundary, even under unusual circumstances. The first few hours were tolerable. Ethan focused on routines, checking the temperature controls, inspecting the filters, monitoring oxygen levels, and ensuring that their food and water supplies were secure. Talara floated quietly in her corner, adjusting the environmental conditions she preferred. At first, he thought she was merely observing, but over time he noticed subtle signs of discomfort, a faint flush on her cheeks, a soft hiss of breath when the air system cycled, and an almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. By the second day, it became clear that Talara was experiencing something unusual. Ethan had read about the mating cycles of her species in the mission's handbook, but the descriptions had been clinical, almost cold. They had spoken of heightened instincts and biological imperatives, without explaining the emotional or physical impact on the individual. Observing her now, he could see that it was more than just biology. There was confusion, vulnerability, and perhaps fear. Ethan considered consulting the medical database, but access was restricted due to the lockdown. He could not risk violating protocol, and besides, he had to rely on what he could observe and the trust he could build. He approached slowly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Talara's eyes met his briefly, and he saw a flicker of something intense, embarrassment maybe, or anxiety. She shook her head slightly, then focused on the floor. Her voice, when it came, was careful, almost rehearsed. I will be fine." "It is temporary," Ethan nodded. He could understand that. Everyone had their vulnerabilities, and some species were private about them. Still, he could not ignore the signs that her body was struggling. He moved to adjust the temperature slightly, lowering it to a level that would ease her discomfort without affecting himself too much. Talara watched the changes silently, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she did not object. Over the next few hours, he observed the patterns of her behavior. She paced lightly, avoided direct eye contact, and occasionally murmured sounds he did not recognize. He stayed nearby, sometimes reading or taking notes, sometimes simply sitting quietly. They did not speak much, but the quiet companionship began to feel natural. By the third day, the situation intensified. Talara's body seemed to react more strongly to the cycle she could not control. Her breathing quickened, and there were moments when she looked almost disoriented. Ethan realized that she could be in pain or extreme discomfort, even if she did not admit it. He remembered the handbook's warning. Species in this stage needed care, or the stress could escalate into dangerous physiological reactions. Ethan adjusted the humidity and moved the air vents to create a more stable microclimate. He even improvised a cooling mat with materials from the lab module. Every action he took was measured and respectful. He avoided direct touch, speaking only when necessary, maintaining as much personal distance as possible. Talara began to watch him with something like cautious appreciation. She did not speak, but the way she paused her pacing and tilted her head suggested that she recognized his efforts. Ethan felt a small surge of relief. Trust was growing, however fragile it might be. On the fourth day, the real challenge began. A planetary storm had worsened, knocking out auxiliary power and causing the temperature regulators to fluctuate. Talara's condition worsened. Her body reacted sharply to each spike, and Ethan realized he would need to intervene more actively. He prepared a temporary cooling chamber using lab materials. It was a careful balance, enough to reduce her discomfort, but not so much that it shocked her system. He spoke in a soft, steady tone as he worked, explaining each step of the process so she would not be alarmed. Talara allowed him to guide her into the chamber, her movements hesitant but compliant. He could feel the tension radiating from her, but he also sensed a flicker of relief. Throughout the day, he monitored her constantly. He recorded data, adjusted settings, and spoke gently to reassure her. Talara's breaths grew steadier, and her eyes occasionally met his, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. In that confined space, under the hum of machines and the red glow of warning panels, they had formed an unspoken connection. It was not friendship yet, but it was trust. By the fifth day, they had settled into a rhythm. Ethan managed the environment, prepared their meals, and kept the habitat safe. Talara followed her routines, sometimes pacing lightly, sometimes resting. Communication was sparse but meaningful. They had learned the small signs: a flick of the tail, a soft sigh, a shift in posture. Each gesture conveyed more than words could. Ethan realized something profound. Being trapped together in this confined space, facing the unknown, was forcing both of them to see the other not as an alien or a human, but as a fellow being with needs, fears, and strengths. He had read countless studies about cooperation between species, but nothing had prepared him for the intimacy of shared survival. As night fell on the fifth day, the storm outside raged against the reinforced walls. Lightning crackled across the darkened sky, illuminating the module in brief flashes. Ethan watched Talara curl up in her resting area, her breathing finally calm. He felt a strange mix of awe and responsibility. He knew that the days ahead would be harder. Her cycle would continue, the lockdown might persist, and challenges would multiply. But for the first time, he felt a deep confidence in his ability to help her, not as a scientist observing a subject, but as a companion respecting another life. And somewhere in that quiet, shared understanding, he thought he saw the first signs that Talara felt the same. They were trapped together. Yes, but in that confinement, a bond was beginning. A bond that neither of them had anticipated, and one that would shape the rest of their time on Relos 4 in ways neither could yet imagine. The following morning brought a heavy quiet to the module. Ethan woke to the soft hum of the life support system, feeling the faint vibration of the planetary storm shaking the walls. Outside, lightning forked across the dark sky, illuminating the landscape in sudden brilliance. Inside, the air was still, but tension lingered. Talara had not moved from her resting area since nightfall, and Ethan could sense that her condition had not improved. He took a deep breath and checked the monitors. Oxygen levels were stable, humidity was slightly higher than preferred, and temperature remained in the comfortable range he had created. It was enough to sustain them, but he knew that Talara's species could feel even the smallest shift. He approached cautiously, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. Talara stirred when he neared, lifting her head and glancing at him with eyes that were sharp, yet weary. The faint flush on her cheeks was back, and he could see her hands tremble slightly. She tried to stand, but a soft hiss escaped her throat. Ethan paused immediately, hands raised in reassurance. "You don't need to move too quickly," he said gently. "Just sit for a moment. I'll adjust the temperature slightly." She nodded, her ears twitching, a subtle sign of agreement. He moved to the control panel and adjusted the air vents, creating a more stable airflow around her resting space. The temperature gradually fell a few degrees and the humidity stabilized. Talara exhaled softly, a sign that she appreciated the care without needing to say so. Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction. Even small victories mattered. He had learned that caring for someone, especially a species so different from his own, required patience and attention to detail. Every adjustment, every action, every careful word could either ease discomfort or add to it. He chose to focus on easing it. Breakfast arrived in the form of rations. Ethan had prepared a tray of nutrient-rich capsules suitable for both humans and Talara's dietary requirements. He set it down a short distance from her and gestured toward it. "Try a little," he suggested. "It will help stabilize your energy." Talara glanced at the tray, then back at him. Her hesitation was brief. Slowly, she picked a single capsule and ingested it. The way she moved was careful, precise, as if she feared making a mistake. Ethan nodded encouragingly. "Good," he said. "You're doing fine." She gave him a fleeting glance, her expression difficult to read. It was gratitude, perhaps, but mingled with something else, something he could not yet name. Ethan turned his attention to the task of monitoring the module, keeping the environment stable while the storm outside raged. Hours passed, and the storm worsened. Lightning struck distant structures, sending faint vibrations through the reinforced walls. Ethan remained attentive, moving between the control panel and Talara's resting area. He noticed subtle changes in her behavior. A quickened pace when she moved, a slight arch of her back, a soft hiss of breath at intervals. Her biological cycle, he realized, was intensifying. He had read about this stage of her species' cycle. The handbook described it as a period of heightened instincts, a time when they became vulnerable to stress and exhaustion. But reading about it was one thing. Witnessing it firsthand was another. Ethan had to act carefully. He could not intervene physically beyond what was necessary, but he could manage the environment, provide support, and remain calm. The first real challenge came in the late afternoon. A surge of electrical activity from the storm caused a brief power fluctuation. Lights flickered, the temperature regulators faltered, and Talara's breathing grew rapid and shallow. She leaned against the wall, eyes wide and unfocused. Ethan moved instantly, stabilizing the power controls and manually regulating the temperature vents. "Talara, stay still," he said firmly, but softly. "I've got this." She nodded, though her hands shook. Ethan could see the strain in her posture, the tension coiled in her limbs. He activated the temporary cooling system he had constructed the previous day. The gentle airflow and lowered temperature helped to stabilize her body, and gradually her breathing returned to normal. She sank onto the floor in relief, closing her eyes briefly. Ethan knelt a short distance away, watching carefully. The module was safe again, but he knew this was only the beginning. Her species cycle would continue for several days, and he would need to remain vigilant. Over the next hours, he engaged her in conversation. He kept his tone calm and neutral, avoiding anything that might be misinterpreted. "Do you remember when you first arrived?" he asked. "It wasn't easy, was it?" Talara's eyes opened slowly. She considered his question, then gave a small nod. "No, it was strange, different." Ethan smiled faintly. "I imagine it was strange for both of us. But you've adapted remarkably." Her gaze softened for a moment, a rare crack in her composed demeanor. She looked away quickly, focusing on the floor. Ethan understood the subtlety. Her pride would not allow her to show too much vulnerability. Yet he also understood that trust was forming, even if silently. As evening approached, the storm outside intensified. The hum of the module and the occasional crack of lightning became a constant presence. Ethan remained alert, keeping the environment steady. He brought water and small food portions closer to her, careful not to disturb her unnecessarily. Talara accepted them with quiet acknowledgement, and for a while they shared the space in companionable silence. By nightfall, the lockdown had entered its third full day. The stress of confinement, combined with Talara's biological cycle, was taxing for both of them. Ethan felt exhaustion creeping in, but he refused to leave his post. The responsibility for another life, especially one so different from his own, was not something he could delegate or ignore. Talara, for her part, had begun to observe Ethan more closely. She noticed his calm under pressure, his careful attention to her comfort, and the way he respected her boundaries. Slowly, the tension in her posture began to ease, and she allowed herself brief moments of rest, trusting him to maintain her safety. The quiet companionship that developed during these long hours was unusual for both species. Humans often valued physical proximity as a sign of cooperation, while Talara's people were accustomed to distance and independence. Yet in the face of shared adversity, they found a middle ground. They did not need to speak constantly to communicate, and sometimes silence itself became a form of understanding. Late that night, the storm began to subside. Lightning faded, leaving only the soft rumble of distant thunder. Ethan checked the environmental controls one last time before sitting near Talara's resting area. He remained alert but allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He realized how much he had learned in just a few days. About Talara, about her species, and about himself. Patience, empathy, and quiet vigilance had become his tools, replacing the expectations of heroism or action that he had carried from Earth. Survival here depended not on strength alone, but on understanding and respect. Talara stirred slightly and her eyes met his. There was no need for words. She did not have to explain the trust that had formed between them. It was evident in the way she relaxed her shoulders, in the faint softness of her gaze, in the way she allowed him to be near without fear. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and pride. They had survived the worst of the first storm together, and they had done so with respect and care for one another. It was an unusual bond, forged in unusual circumstances, but it was a bond nonetheless. As he finally lay down in his own resting area, Ethan felt the hum of the life support system, the distant sound of the storm fading and the quiet presence of Talara nearby. He knew that the days ahead would bring new challenges. Her cycle would continue, the lockdown might persist, and the storm could return. But he also knew that they would face it together. Trust had been established. Understanding had been forged. And in the quiet, confined space of the module, two very different beings had begun to see one another as allies, as companions, and perhaps in some subtle way, as friends. Ethan closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of peace. Outside, Relos 4 continued to rumble with storms and lockdowns, but inside the module there was safety, stability, and the quiet knowledge that they were not alone. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, they could survive anything the planet had to throw at them. The fourth day of lockdown arrived quietly but carried a tension that was hard to ignore. Ethan woke to the familiar hum of the life support systems, but the air felt heavier than usual. Outside, the remnants of the storm had left the skies dark and turbulent, and the soft vibrations of distant lightning trembled through the reinforced walls. Talara had been awake for hours already, pacing lightly near her resting area, her long hair swaying with each step. Ethan noticed immediately that her movements were faster, sharper, almost erratic. She paused frequently as if trying to steady herself, but the signs of discomfort were clear. Her breathing was quicker, her ears twitched at every sound, and her tail flicked with subtle agitation. He had studied her species' biology enough to recognize that her current state was part of the natural cycle she could not control, but that did not make it easier to watch. He approached carefully, making sure his hands were visible, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "Talara," he said gently, "let's check the environment. I want to make sure you're comfortable." She looked at him, her pale eyes narrowing briefly, then gave a small nod. Her trust, though fragile, was becoming more evident with each day. Ethan adjusted the air vents and temperature controls, lowering the temperature slightly and stabilizing the airflow around her. The soft hum of the cooling system helped, and for a brief moment she seemed to relax, leaning against the wall and closing her eyes. Even with the small relief, Ethan knew that this stage would be prolonged and more demanding. Her species experienced heightened instincts and sensitivity during these periods, and confinement made everything more intense. He had to be alert, ready to intervene when necessary, but careful to respect her boundaries. Any misstep could increase her stress or discomfort. The morning passed in a rhythm of careful observation and minor adjustments. Ethan brought her water and nutrient capsules, placing them within easy reach without intruding. Talara accepted them quietly, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. She did not speak much, but her body language indicated a growing appreciation for his efforts. Midday brought a new challenge. A minor power fluctuation caused the cooling system to fail temporarily. Talara reacted immediately, her body stiffening, her breathing quickening. She stepped back, startled, as if the sudden change had caught her off guard. Ethan acted swiftly, stabilizing the system and restoring the temperature controls manually. "It's okay," he said softly. "Everything is back to normal." Her ears flicked and she exhaled slowly, a sign that she was calming down. Ethan realized that his presence itself was becoming a source of reassurance. She did not need him to fix every problem. She needed him to remain calm and steady. His patience was a stabilizing factor in a time when her instincts were chaotic. As the afternoon progressed, Talara's condition intensified. Ethan noticed subtle patterns in her behavior. Pacing became more frequent, her tail flicked faster, and she murmured soft, indecipherable sounds under her breath. These sounds were part of her species' natural response, expressions of instinct and discomfort. Ethan did not attempt to interpret them fully. Instead, he focused on providing a stable environment and minimizing stressors. He prepared a small resting area near the cooling chamber he had built the previous day. He added extra cushions and blankets, creating a space where she could lie down without feeling confined. When he guided her gently toward the area, she allowed him to help, moving slowly but without resistance. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft and almost vulnerable. It was rare for her to speak in such a way, and Ethan recognized it as a sign of growing trust. "You don't have to thank me," he replied gently. "I'm here to help." They remained in quiet companionship for a while. Ethan read his data logs, adjusting minor environmental factors while Talara rested. Occasionally, she would glance at him, her gaze lingering longer each time. The unspoken communication between them was becoming richer. Trust was no longer a fragile concept. It was a bond forming in the quiet spaces of shared struggle. Later, a warning light flashed across the control panel. A secondary storm had begun forming on the planet's horizon. The system indicated increased wind activity and minor seismic shifts. Ethan realized that the lockdown could extend for several more days. They were still confined, still relying on each other for survival. He moved to secure additional supplies, rationing food and water for the coming period. Talara observed quietly, occasionally assisting in ways that respected her physical limits. She did not speak much, but her presence was steadying. Even in moments of discomfort, she contributed in her way, reinforcing the subtle partnership that had developed. As evening approached, Talara's condition required more careful attention. Ethan prepared the cooling chamber, adjusting the temperature and humidity to optimal levels. He spoke softly as he guided her, explaining each step to avoid startling her. Her ears twitched, but she followed his instructions, trusting him completely. "You're doing very well," he said, keeping his tone calm. "Just a little longer." She inclined her head, a small gesture of acknowledgement. For Ethan, every small gesture mattered. They were signs of connection, of understanding, of a bond that transcended species differences. The night brought another challenge. The planetary storm intensified unexpectedly, sending vibrations through the module. Lightning flashed, and the air filled with a faint electrical charge. Talara's reactions were immediate. Her breathing quickened, her tail lashed, and her ears flicked in rapid succession. Ethan remained calm, monitoring her closely and adjusting the environmental controls to stabilize the module. He realized that his role was no longer just about survival. It was about providing emotional support as well. His calm presence reassured her in ways he could not fully explain. She responded to him not only as a caregiver but as a companion, someone she could rely on in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and frightening. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but the module remained stable. Talara's condition slowly eased, and she allowed herself to rest fully in the cooling chamber. Ethan stayed nearby, recording environmental data and ensuring the system remained operational. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer tense or awkward. By the early morning hours, the storm had subsided. Ethan checked Talara's condition carefully. She was breathing steadily, her body relaxed, and her eyes occasionally flicked toward him with quiet recognition. He smiled faintly, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. They had survived another day, another challenge together. The following day brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Talara began to move more freely within the module, pacing less frequently and taking moments to observe her surroundings. She still showed signs of discomfort, but they were less intense. Ethan continued to provide support, adjusting environmental factors, preparing food and water, and maintaining a stable atmosphere. Through these long hours, they began to communicate more naturally. Words were still limited, but gestures, glances, and subtle movements conveyed understanding. Ethan learned to recognize the signs of her needs before she expressed them. Talara, in turn, began to anticipate his actions, adjusting her own behavior to align with the routines he had established. One afternoon, as they worked together to stabilize a minor power fluctuation, Talara spoke more openly than before. "Your species is different than I expected," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Ethan looked at her, intrigued. "Different how?" he asked. "You are patient. You are calm. You observe without demanding," she replied. "I did not expect that from humans," he smiled faintly. "I've learned that patience is important when you care about someone's well-being, no matter their species." She considered this, then inclined her head slightly. It was a small gesture, but it carried significance. In her culture, acknowledgement of understanding was meaningful, and Ethan recognized the weight of her action. As the day drew to a close, the storm outside returned, softer this time, more distant. Ethan prepared the cooling chamber for another night, adjusting environmental factors to ensure Talara's comfort. She followed his guidance willingly, trusting him to manage the situation. That night, as they settled into their respective areas, Ethan reflected on the events of the past few days. The lockdown had forced them into close proximity, but it had also created a space for mutual understanding and trust. He realized that the bond forming between them was not simply about survival. It was about connection, empathy, and the recognition of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. Talara, for her part, had begun to observe him more closely. She noticed his calm under pressure, his careful attention to her comfort, and the subtle ways he anticipated her needs. Slowly, she allowed herself to relax in his presence, acknowledging that in this confined space she was not alone. By the end of Part 3, both had adjusted to the rhythm of shared confinement. Challenges remained. The planetary storm continued to rage intermittently. Her biological cycle would persist, and the lockdown was ongoing. But they had found a way to navigate it together. Trust and understanding had become their foundation, and in that quiet, controlled environment, they began to see each other not as alien and human, but as companions facing the unknown together. They were still very different beings, each with unique. The 5th day of lockdown began with a tense quiet that hung over the module. Ethan woke to the soft hum of the life support systems, yet the air felt thick with anticipation. The distant rumbles of storms from the planet outside were constant reminders that they were still trapped, that the quarantine showed no signs of lifting. He rubbed his eyes, stretched, and checked the environmental monitors. Everything was stable for now, but he knew it would not stay that way. Talara had already begun her morning routine, pacing lightly near her resting area. Her long white hair reflected the dim artificial light, and the subtle movements of her tail and ears indicated that her instincts were stronger than ever. Ethan observed her carefully. Each flick, each tremor was a message he was learning to read. He approached slowly, hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Good morning," he said softly. "I'll check the environmental controls. Let's make sure you're comfortable." Talara glanced at him and gave a brief nod, her expression guarded but appreciative. Ethan adjusted the temperature slightly, stabilized the airflow, and lowered the humidity where possible. The subtle changes brought her visible relief. A slow exhale, a momentary softening of her posture. Breakfast followed in the form of nutrient-rich capsules and water. Ethan prepared the tray carefully, mindful of her preferences. He placed it at a respectful distance and gestured toward it. "Here," he said gently. "Take your time. Eat when you feel ready." Talara approached cautiously, selecting a capsule and swallowing it with precision. Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, a faint acknowledgement of his effort. Ethan smiled. Even small gestures mattered. Every sign of trust, every indication that she felt safer in his presence was a step forward. The morning passed quietly, punctuated only by the storm's distant rumbling. Then the planetary sensors indicated an unexpected spike in wind and seismic activity. The secondary storm had intensified and it was moving closer to their outpost. Ethan immediately checked the module's structural integrity. All systems were functioning, but the increased stress on the habitat meant that any minor malfunction could escalate quickly. "Talara," he said, keeping his voice calm, "we need to be prepared. The storm is getting stronger. I'll make sure the module stays safe, but I'll need you to stay close and follow my instructions." Her ears twitched, and her eyes widened slightly. She inclined her head in agreement. Ethan began securing supplies, reinforcing structural supports within the module where possible. He moved quickly but deliberately, aware that sudden movements could alarm her. Talara followed him silently, occasionally assisting where her agility allowed. By midday, the storm was fully upon them. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the module's interior in brief, bright bursts. The walls vibrated with the force of the wind outside, and the air carried a faint electrical charge. Talara's condition, already delicate, became more pronounced. She paced in short bursts, her breathing quicker, her tail flicking almost constantly. Ethan realized that the combination of her biological cycle and the stress of the storm could overwhelm her. He moved to prepare the cooling chamber again, reinforcing it with additional insulation and adjusting the temperature to the lowest safe level. He spoke softly as he guided her toward it. "Step inside slowly," he instructed. "I'm here. You're safe." Talara followed, her movements careful but compliant. She settled into the chamber, leaning against the soft cushions he had arranged. Ethan monitored the system closely, adjusting airflow and temperature, keeping a respectful distance while ensuring her comfort. Hours passed. The storm outside battered the module relentlessly. Ethan stayed vigilant, monitoring environmental controls, rationing food and water, and keeping the cooling system running smoothly. Talara rested intermittently, her breathing gradually stabilizing, though occasional tremors reminded him of the ongoing intensity of her cycle. During one brief moment of calm, Ethan decided to speak, keeping his tone calm and neutral. "We've managed well so far," he said. "The storm is strong, but we're stronger. We'll get through this together." Talara lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was a faint flicker of something in her gaze. Gratitude, perhaps, or acknowledgement. She did not speak, but her posture softened, a subtle sign that she trusted him. Even as exhaustion pressed on both of them, they maintained a quiet rhythm. Ethan checked the systems repeatedly, ensuring stability, while Talara allowed herself to rest in short intervals. They had become attuned to each other's presence, anticipating needs and responding without unnecessary words. Late in the evening, the storm reached its peak. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the module shuddered under the force of strong winds. A minor power surge caused a temporary blackout in one section of the habitat. Talara reacted immediately, her instincts heightened. She stepped back, ears flattened slightly, tail flicking rapidly. Ethan moved to stabilize the system manually, keeping his movements smooth and deliberate. "It's okay," he said softly. "I've got it. You don't need to move." Her breathing remained rapid, but she obeyed, trusting his words. Ethan restored power to the affected section, reinforced the cooling system, and adjusted environmental controls. Gradually, Talara's breathing slowed, and she sank back onto the cushions in relief. By nightfall, the storm had passed its peak, though it continued to rumble in the distance. Ethan stayed vigilant, monitoring the module and ensuring all systems were stable. Talara rested quietly, occasionally glancing at him with subtle acknowledgement. As the night wore on, their interaction became less about direct assistance and more about companionship. They shared the confined space in silence, each aware of the other's presence. Ethan noted the small gestures, Talara leaning slightly in his direction when he adjusted the cooling system, her soft exhale of relief after minor interventions, and the occasional flick of her tail signaling trust. He realized that their connection had grown beyond simple survival. They were learning to rely on one another, to anticipate needs, and to provide reassurance through calm, deliberate action. The lockdown had forced them into proximity, but it had also created a space for empathy, understanding, and mutual respect. The next morning brought a sense of cautious optimism. The storm had receded somewhat, though the planet remained turbulent. Ethan checked all systems carefully, noting minor adjustments that would help Talara remain comfortable. She followed his lead, moving with more confidence and less agitation. During a brief lull, Ethan spoke softly. "You've done very well. I know this cycle is difficult, but you're handling it with strength." Talara's ears flicked and she inclined her head slightly. Your presence. It helps, she admitted quietly. Ethan felt a warmth spread through him at her words. It was rare for her species to acknowledge emotional support so openly, and he recognized the significance. Trust was no longer fragile. It was becoming a firm foundation. As the day progressed, Talara began to assist more actively within her capacity. She monitored environmental indicators, adjusted minor settings in the module, and followed Ethan's guidance during small tasks. Their cooperation was seamless, a blend of human problem-solving and alien instincts. By evening, both were exhausted but relieved. They had survived another round of the storm and managed the challenges of Talara's cycle with patience and care. Ethan reflected on the progress they had made. The bond forming between them was not romantic. It was deeper than that. It was mutual respect, trust, and the recognition of each other's strength and vulnerability. Late that night, as they settled into their respective areas, Ethan felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. They were not merely surviving. They were learning, adapting, and growing stronger together. The lockdown would continue and challenges would remain, but he felt confident in their ability to face them. Talara, for her part, rested with a calm she had not known at the start of the quarantine. She had come to understand that Ethan's care was consistent, respectful, and reliable. In a world where her instincts were unpredictable and her body demanded attention she could not control, he provided stability. That stability, she realized, was invaluable. As the module settled into silence, with the storm rumbling softly in the distance, both Ethan and Talara drifted into sleep. Their minds were alert yet calm, their bodies exhausted yet safe, in the quiet of confinement. They had formed a connection that transcended species, instinct, and circumstance, a connection built on respect, trust, and shared perseverance. The days ahead would test them further. Talara's cycle would continue. Planetary conditions could worsen and the lockdown might persist indefinitely, but they had discovered something essential. Together, they could face whatever challenges arose, and in the process, they were learning not only about each other, but about the strength that humans and aliens could share when they worked in harmony. The sixth day of lockdown began with a fragile calm. Ethan awoke to the familiar hum of the life support system and the faint glow of artificial light filtering through the module. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the distant echo of wind over the barren landscape. Talara had already risen, moving slowly, her long white hair trailing lightly behind her as she surveyed the module. Ethan approached cautiously, mindful of her still sensitive condition. "Morning," he said softly. "I'll check the environment before you get too active." She nodded, her ears flicking in acknowledgement, and Ethan adjusted the temperature, airflow, and humidity. Even minor changes caused a visible reaction. A soft exhale, a subtle relaxation of her shoulders, a flick of her tail. These small gestures reminded him how delicate the balance had become between her comfort and her instincts. Breakfast followed. The same nutrient-rich capsules and water they had relied on throughout the lockdown. Ethan prepared the tray and placed it within easy reach, speaking softly as he guided her toward it. Talara accepted it without hesitation, and for a moment they shared a quiet companionship that needed no words. The morning passed slowly but without incident. Talara's cycle, once chaotic and unpredictable, had begun to stabilize. The combination of careful environmental management and Ethan's patient presence had allowed her body to adjust. She moved more freely, though still cautiously, and she began to observe him with subtle interest. Her trust, built over days of careful attention, was now evident in her gestures and glances. By midday, the planetary sensors indicated a minor surge in seismic activity. The storm, though diminished, still carried unpredictable energy. Ethan moved to reinforce the module, checking structural integrity, recalibrating the environmental controls, and ensuring all emergency systems were operational. Talara assisted where possible, her movements precise and careful. Together they worked as a team, blending human problem-solving with alien agility. During a brief pause, Ethan glanced at her. "You're handling this remarkably well," he said. Talara's ears twitched and she inclined her head slightly. "I feel safer," she admitted softly. Ethan smiled faintly. The words were simple, yet they carried a depth of meaning. She had allowed herself to trust him fully, and that trust had transformed the confined space of the module into a shared sanctuary. It was more than survival. It was understanding, companionship, and the recognition of each other's resilience. Afternoon brought a new challenge. A minor electrical surge caused the lighting in part of the module to flicker, startling Talara. Her breathing quickened, and her tail flicked in agitation. Ethan remained calm, moving smoothly to stabilize the system. "It's okay," he said gently. "Everything is fine. I've got it." She watched him closely, her breathing gradually returning to normal as he repaired the affected circuits. In that moment, Ethan realized that his presence had become a source of reassurance, a steadying force that allowed her instincts to settle. The hours passed in careful rhythm. Ethan monitored the environment, ensured the module remained stable, and prepared food and water. Talara rested and observed, her gestures and movements conveying a quiet cooperation. The bond between them had evolved into a subtle, unspoken understanding. They anticipated each other's needs, offered support without prompting, and maintained calm amidst the uncertainty of their confinement. As evening approached, the sky outside showed the first signs of clearing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm landscape bathed in muted light. Ethan adjusted the lighting inside the module, creating a warm, stable atmosphere. Talara emerged from the cooling chamber, moving with more confidence than she had in days. "You've done well," Ethan said softly. "The storm is ending and you're more comfortable now." Talara's eyes met his, and for the first time she allowed a faint, genuine smile to appear. It was subtle, but it carried significance, a recognition of shared struggle, mutual care, and growing trust. They spent the evening in quiet companionship, sharing small tasks within the module. Ethan prepared rations for the following day, checked the environmental monitors, and made minor adjustments to the habitat. Talara assisted where she could, following his guidance and demonstrating a remarkable balance between her instincts and cooperative intent. During a quiet moment, Ethan spoke softly, almost to himself. "It's strange," he said. "We started this lockdown as strangers from completely different worlds, and now we've learned to rely on each other." Talara's ears twitched, and she tilted her head. "Strange, yes, but not unpleasant," she replied. Ethan smiled faintly. The simplicity of her words carried weight. They had endured fear, uncertainty, and discomfort, yet in that process they had built a connection that transcended species and circumstance. It was a bond founded on trust, respect, and the ability to respond calmly under pressure. The night passed peacefully. For the first time in days, the module remained undisturbed by storms or power surges. Ethan checked the monitors periodically but found everything stable. Talara slept nearby, her breathing steady and relaxed. The sense of shared safety was palpable, a quiet testament to the effort, patience, and understanding that had carried them through the lockdown. Morning arrived with soft light spilling into the module. Ethan stirred first, checking the monitors and environmental controls. Everything was functioning smoothly. The storm had truly passed, and with it came the possibility of leaving the lockdown module for the first time in nearly a week. Talara emerged shortly after, moving with renewed energy and confidence. She observed the outside world cautiously, but without the previous tension. Ethan gestured toward the observation window. "The storm has passed," he said. "We can move outside safely now." Her eyes widened at the sight of the calm landscape. The planet's surface, once obscured by lightning and heavy winds, now revealed sweeping plains and distant hills, bathed in muted sunlight. Talara's breathing softened, and she allowed herself a small exhale of relief. Ethan opened the module's main hatch, and they stepped outside carefully. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of ozone from the storm. Talara paused, her eyes scanning the horizon, then glanced at him with a faint smile. "You guided me through this," she said quietly. "I understand your species better now," Ethan nodded. "And I understand yours. We've learned from each other, and we've made it through together." They walked a short distance from the module, testing the terrain. The planet's surface was uneven, but stable, and the storm had left behind only small puddles and scattered debris. Talara moved with agility, her movements precise and controlled. Ethan followed, careful to match her pace. As they explored the cleared area, they talked softly, sharing observations and impressions of the planet. Talara described her people's adaptations to extreme weather, their instincts during heightened biological cycles, and the ways they traditionally managed stress and discomfort. Ethan shared human perspectives, the ways people adapted to confinement, and the patience required to manage uncertainty. The exchange was not just educational, it was a bridge between worlds, a demonstration of mutual respect and learning. They were no longer merely human and alien. They were companions, collaborators, and allies in a challenging environment. By late afternoon, they returned to the module. Ethan secured the hatch and checked all systems one final time. Talara observed, her gaze calm and reflective. They had endured the storm, navigated the challenges of her biological cycle, and survived the extended lockdown. In the process, they had formed a bond that neither time nor distance could easily erase. As evening fell, they sat together near the observation window. The landscape outside was calm, the sky painted with soft hues of twilight. Talara's long hair caught the fading light, and she regarded Ethan with an expression of quiet acknowledgement. "You've been patient, careful, and kind," she said softly. "I trust you." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him. "And I trust you," he replied. "We've faced the unknown together, and we've learned how to rely on each other." The night settled over the module, peaceful and undisturbed. Ethan and Talara rested, knowing that the lockdown had ended, that the storm had passed, and that they had emerged stronger, calmer, and more understanding of one another. Their connection was not one of necessity alone. It was built on patience, care, and the recognition of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. In the quiet, confined space where fear and discomfort had once dominated, trust and companionship now reigned. Ethan and Talara had endured the storm, navigated the challenges of her species' biological cycle, and learned to depend on each other in ways neither could have predicted. As they finally drifted into sleep, a sense of calm settled over the module. The storm had passed, the lockdown was over, and they were free to face the world outside together. Their journey had been difficult, but it had forged a bond that transcended worlds, a connection built on understanding, patience, and the quiet courage to care for another being. No matter how different, the planet was calm, the air clear, and the future uncertain. Yet for the first time in days, Ethan and Talara felt a sense of hope, safety, and companionship. They had survived together, learned from each other, and discovered that even in the most challenging circumstances, cooperation, empathy, and trust could build bridges stronger than any storm.